Askuikwasanumis. Hello, everybody. Kanupiam, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's Lunch and Learn series. Throughout this series, we have presented a variety of topics to assist in the understanding of Indigenous history, culture, and current events, and the continued efforts to preserve and share cultural knowledge and traditional lifeways. This year's featuring monthly presentations by historians, educators, and Indigenous knowledge keepers. Recordings of this and all previous presentations will be available on our YouTube page. Just give us a couple of weeks to get the new recordings posted. This free educational program has been made possible with the support of many, including the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the United Way, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, and of course, community support from donors like you. Thank you so much for your support. Now, a quick reminder to just place yourself on mute, and please keep yourself on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, put them, questions or comments, place them in the chat throughout the presentation. At the end, we will address them as time allows. Today's presentation is entitled Our Communion Day, Illuminating the Legacy of Tribal Churches with Kimonee Burke. Kimonee Burke is a Ph.D. candidate in the History Department at Brown University. She's a citizen of the Narragansett Indian Tribe and my little cousin. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College, her Master's of Studies in U.S. History from the University of Oxford, and her Master of Arts in History from Brown University. Burke studies Indigenous history in New England and the impact of federal policies on the tribes of the region. So please join me in welcoming Kimonee Burke.
Thank you for the introduction, Silvermoon. And thank you everyone for joining today. Today I'm going to be talking about the legacy of 4 tribal churches here in southern New England: the Narragansett Indian Church, the Mohegan Church, the Old Indian Meeting House in Mashpee, and the Community Baptist Church of Gayhead, as well as the impact of Christianity on tribal life from the colonial period into the 20th century. And my goal today is to shed a little bit of light on how these tribal institutions, these tribal churches, provided space and structure for Indigenous resistance, reinvention, and survivance over time. And I think today, as the US and Canada are being forced to reckon with the damage that religious boarding schools and industrial schools left behind within Indigenous communities, it's important for me to acknowledge the harm in those places that was done in the name of Christianity. But this talk is going to be touching on the ways that Indigenous people created networks to coexist with and utilize tribal churches and Christianity to strengthen their own communities and persist. And while tribal churches acted as houses of worship and a space for indigenized Christianities to form, what people might refer to as syncretic faith, they were much more than that. But I think the best way to highlight the kind of enmeshment of tribal churches' Indigenous life that I'm trying to describe is with a story. And so that's where we're going to begin today. So on September 22nd, 1900, the Senate Committee of Indian Affairs called a meeting at the Fifth Avenue Hotel with tribal representatives from the Narragansett, Mohegan, Shinnecock, and Montauk nations. And they were there to discuss grievances regarding the theft of tribal lands. The Mohegan delegate Lemuel Fielding and Narragansett council members Joshua and John Noka and John Seketow arrived from Connecticut and Rhode Island, respectively prepared to make arguments for a payout from the settlement at the Treaty of Buffalo Creek in 1838. They were also there to argue for recompense for the reservations and coastal lands that they argued they'd been swindled out of back in New England. Similarly, the Shinnecock and Montauk representatives were there to protest the lack of reimbursement for their tribal lands along the southeastern tip of New York. There to receive and register their grievances were Senators Orville Platt of Connecticut and J.M. Thurston of Nebraska, along with a host of local press that had gathered to hear the latest tribal scandal before the federal government. Now, in the middle of this hearing, Joshua Noka takes the stand, and he describes exactly how detribalization and the loss of tribal lands, but especially access to the coast, upended Narragansett life. He also gives us a window into the function of church attendance in the mid-19th century. Noka stated that He looked upon it as a principle that they, the state, had taken all the rest of their land, which we have not occupied, on which our mothers and fathers, our brothers and sisters would go down on the seashore to catch oysters and clams and fish if they chose, and stay down there, carry down their blankets and camp there for a certain time. But at certain times of the year they would go home, and sure when they did, it was on what we called our communion day. Once in 4 weeks was communion that the Narragansetts held in the church. Everybody then made a practice of going to church. Whatever they had to do, they always looked for those who had gone down on the shore to return home on that day. And so that ends Noka's quote from that day. And while Joshua Noka certainly highlighted what was lost by detribalization, or the forced disbandment of his tribe, we also get a glimpse into tribal life in the decades before disbandment. What we hear Noka describing at the turn of the century embodies the ways that the Narragansett had found a way to not only tolerate or cooperate with the presence of Christianity in their tribe, but a way to incorporate it into the fabric of tribal life. Attending the church on communion wasn't an obligatory duty. Instead, it was their communion day, a simple way to reconnect with family and ensure cohesion, despite the natural coming and going to the shoreline for sustenance. So today I'm going to begin by talking a bit about the early missionary efforts in the region, which set the groundwork for the churches in these tribal communities. Then I'm going to shift my focus and look at 4 distinct case studies, well actually 5. And these are examples where we see churches being utilized as vehicles of sovereignty in the 18th and 19th century. I'll then touch briefly to discuss why churches' prevalence as sites of indigeneity following the state of detribalization between 1860 and 1880 is so important. And then I'm going to close by highlighting some of the reasons that churches continue to be vital to Indigenous communities moving into the 20th century. So we'll begin by looking at the development of the praying town system and motivations for early conversions amongst Indigenous people. Then I'm going to go ahead and introduce the tribal churches more distinctly, and I'll spend the rest of the time discussing those. So when the English first invaded what would come to be known as southern New England, evangelization was not immediately seen as the clearest path forward as they found their footing in the region. Colonists were striving to form bonds with local tribal communities, and individuals like Roger Williams made these inroads, but these early liaisons lacked any real social or political leverage to change Native perspectives. And despite some efforts during this early period, talking like the 1620s, early 1630s, it was not a widespread concern for colonists to convert them, and they looked to secure their land base primarily through negotiation or violence. And so with the outbreak and fallout of the Pequot War from roughly 1636 to 1638, colonists create this power vacuum that is created not only through the killing of Pequot people, but also the mass enslavement of them during the conflict. And that leads tribes throughout southern New England to seek political favor with the English out of fear of retribution. And so the signing of the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, which establishes the English as the new authority in the region, it further goes on to declare that the Mohegan and Narragansett, the remaining military powers in the region, were required to appeal to the English, that's a quote, before making any political or military action moving forward. It's worth noting that much of this power was imagined on the part of the English, but still their claim to authority, fragile as it might have actually been, embodied a significant shift in their perception of themselves in their own jurisdiction. And this shift ultimately leads to the English actively pursuing a mutual ideology with the Indigenous communities. So this is the point at which they turn to conversion. So the turn to Christianizing Indigenous peoples didn't come out of nowhere. In 1630, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, the charter for the colony included a line that stated that the colonists would win and incite the natives of the country to the knowledge and obedience of the only true God and Savior of mankind. Or to put that in much plainer language, that colonists would bring the gospel to Indigenous people in the colony. Now, it's important to note that this mission statement, so to speak, was more reflective of Protestants' desire to combat the spread of Catholicism in the New World, air quotes on New World, than it was about any investment in changing the worldview of Indigenous people. After all, the justification for taking native lands came from the fact that they weren't Christianized. But still, we can see this portion of the colony's charter physically represented in the colony's original seal, which features an Indigenous man with a banner coming out of his mouth stating, "Come over and help us," which is a supposed plea for Christianization. And although the modern seal has ditched the banner, we can see here that it's still modeled after that original Massachusetts Bay Colony one. So the first successful formalized missionary efforts came beginning in 1644 from Massachusetts Bay Colony officials, and it initially comes when they pass this law pertaining to the Christianization of natives that announces that Indigenous people residing in English towns should be instructed in the knowledge and worship of God. At the same time, the colony began to make legal moves to back its charter statement. Reverend John Eliot, a young missionary residing in Roxbury, Massachusetts, determines that the best path towards converting Indigenous people would be to learn their language and to work to convert them in a Christianized environment where they would be surrounded by their own people. And this model comes to be known as the praying town. So these towns were modeled after English villages, and within them, Indigenous people resided in English-style homes. They attended church and school regularly. They were expected to adopt English gendered labor norms, with men farming while women were taught to sew and weave. And families were given individual plots of land in order to encourage individual land ownership. Also in these villages, they were forced to begin learning to speak English and just in general adopt an English culture. Now, just a bit of a side note, it's worth noting that Indigenous people already had advanced agricultural practices, and they did have concepts of land ownership or private property, but these were largely overseen by women in these communities, and thus they did not meet British standards for various racialized and sexist reasons. And that's a discussion for a whole other day, but I do think it needs to be noted. Now, Eliot's linguistic efforts led him to begin preaching to members of the Massachusetts tribe at the village of Neponset in 1646. But it was at Nonantum that his mission caught on, and his vision for evangelization was eventually backed by the colonial government. So this leads to Eliot establishing Natick, the first praying town, in 1651. And so you might be wondering, what were some of the reasons that led Indigenous people to convert during this period? And I think one of the ones that maybe shouldn't be overemphasized, but certainly shouldn't be ignored, is the role of disease. So in the 16 teens and the 1620s, there are two major epidemics that sweep through the region, and it completely shifts the political landscape. And tribes that are affected by these outbreaks are far more willing to form an alliance with the English than those that are not. So this is why we specifically see Nipmuc and Massachusetts people being amongst the first to pick up the Christian banner, so to speak. Another way in which disease impacts this, there's at least one example where Indigenous people were moved to convert to Christianity after members who had already converted were unaffected by an outbreak of disease. And essentially, having seen these people unaffected, they're wondering, well, do these people have a spiritual power I don't? Is that why they were protected? And so these are some of the ways that disease impacts conversion. I think the primary reason that we certainly can't ignore is the threat of violence. Following the Pequot War, many Indigenous people felt like they had to align themselves with the English, and if adopting Christianity was a way to do that, then they were willing to do so. There are legal protections that also came with converting. So following the initial legislation regarding Christianization, they were followed up by colonial laws that protected praying Indians, which is what these praying town residents referred to, and protected their rights to land and property. It also gave them some level of legal recourse in the court systems, and there were protective orders forbidding hostilities against them. And so while these are some of the pragmatic reasons for Native people to adopt Christianity, these justifications do not account for the longevity of the congregations or the ways that the church and Christian practices became knitted into multiple aspects of tribal life. And so I think it's important to note that some people converted because they were genuinely moved by the tenets of the gospel. So between 1651 and the outbreak of the Indian War, or King Philip's War, in 1675, numerous praying towns are established in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth, and Connecticut. And I think it's also important to note that despite the geographic spread of these praying towns, the vast majority of praying Indians were Massachusetts and Nipmuc peoples. And during King Philip's War, these citizens actually end up catching the brunt of colonial violence. They're essentially sitting ducks in the midst of all these English villages when the hostilities break out. And while many of these praying Indians are killed in raids by colonists, despite the protective orders that already existed, and many are also forcefully held hostage on Deer Island and Boston Harbor, where many passed from starvation and exposure. And so this betrayal by colonial authorities who had promised praying Indians some semblance of equal rights brought an end to the praying town model. But there were still tribal churches that persisted from this period, and others that would be built after the war. And so the rest of my talk is going to focus on the 4 churches you see listed below. So I'll be talking about the old Indian Meeting House, which was established in 1684, and replaced an earlier church that was built in 1670, but destroyed during King Philip's War. This church served and has continued to serve the Mashpee Wampanoag. It was utilized by tribal members as both a religious and political space for tribal meetings. The Community Baptist Church of Gayhead. The original structure was built in between 1693 and 1698, although the congregation at Gayhead dates back to the 1670s or 1670s. And it should be noted that the name Community Baptist was only adopted in the 1940s. Prior to that, it was the Indian Baptist Church of Gayhead, and it likely had a different title back when it was founded. Then we have the Narragansett Indian Church, which was tribally founded in 1743 by the Narragansett tribe itself to break away from colonial oversight. And I'll be talking about that a little later. And then the 4th church I'll be focusing on is the Mohegan Church, which was established in 1831 by Mohegan tribal members and their allies in order to resist American expansion in the 19th century. So in these next sections, I'll be talking more about how these 4 churches were utilized by the respective communities through these 4 general themes. So I want us to be thinking about how churches functioned as a space for Indigenous communities in terms of being a spatial hub, but also being a physical symbol of their presence and just being a meeting space for them. I want us to also think about how indigenized Christianities were able to flourish in here. And so I have that under the heading of spirit, and to think about the religious ways in which these churches acted for these communities. Thirdly, I want us to think about how the church was quite literally a sanctuary for these tribes in many ways that will become clearer as I go on in this talk. And lastly, I want us to think about the church as a state in the sense that it was at times utilized as a political body by tribal members, whether that was to protest for their own personal needs or actually functioning as a government for the tribe when their other governments were under assault or struggling. So I just want us to hold these general 4 themes in mind, and I'll come back to them at the conclusion. It might be a little clearer why I've got these 4 sub-themes. Okay. So throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, many of the remaining tribal congregations were overseen by large missionary organizations like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Despite the continued presence of these organizations and non-Indigenous influences, we see a shift that takes place the longer that Native peoples are exposed to Christianity. Missionaries complain that the Indigenous people's faith is syncretic, so they are still holding on to some traditional practices, even as they're practicing Christianity. And so rather than the abandonment of traditional faiths that colonial officials had desired, Native people had found ways to preserve their own life ways within these churches. And it's worth noting that this is not a unique phenomenon to this region. And we can actually see this in Indigenous communities worldwide in their own use and creativity around the introduction of Christianity. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start this talk at Aquinnah, and that's largely because I want to try to move as chronologically as I can going through these histories. So Christianity was introduced to the Wampanoag at Aquinnah, or Gay Head, in 1642 by Thomas Mayhew Sr. and his son Thomas Jr. They were both Congregationalist missionaries from what we now call Vineyard Haven. And their mission actually took a while to gain traction. Aquinnah was actually the last village on Nuepe, or Martha's Vineyard, to accept a missionary. But once the faith was adopted, Wampanoag converts quickly became key figures in spreading Christianity themselves. And this started as early as the mid-17th century. So one of the first and most influential converts was a Wampanoag man named Hyakuns, who embraced the faith early in Thomas Mayhew Jr.'s missionary work. And he soon began preaching to other Wampanoag communities, and his effort led to the faith catching on in the area. The second turning point came with the conversion of Mitarch, who was a sachem at Aquinnah. And though he was briefly exiled to the eastern part of the island because of his beliefs, Mitarch returns in 1666, and he co-founds the original church at Aquinnah with Mayhew Sr. This church eventually evolved into the first Baptist congregation on Martha's Vineyard, marking a break from the earlier Congregationalist presence. And a wooden Baptist meeting house was eventually built for the new congregation in the 1690s. There was likely an earlier church structure, but there is no date associated with it. Now, despite this early embrace of Christianity, the Wampanoag are amongst some of the first to embrace this praying town model. The Wampanoag at Aquinnah found ways to maintain their traditions even within this colonial framework, and they continued to speak their language and used Bibles and hymnals that had been translated into it, which was part of Eliot's work back in the 1640s and onward, was creating an Indigenous Bible so that Indigenous people could actually learn the Bible in their own languages. And that came to be known as the Eliot Bible. Should have mentioned that earlier. But back to Aquinnah, while the church was a Christian space, many traditional beliefs and practices were preserved and woven into their worship. Now, the church and the praying town system also allowed the Wampanoag to quietly preserve their traditional government. They maintained a hereditary sachemship for about 4 generations after the Mayhews arrived, and from roughly 1640 to 1722. But instead of outwardly using the traditional title, at this point, these individuals were recognized as the ministers and constables of the praying town. Even after colonial-style elections were introduced to the praying town at Aquinnah, leadership roles often still stayed within the same families who had held authority before European contact. Mitarch himself, once sachem, became the church's first minister, a role that stayed in his family for generations, and leadership flowed both ways. Church leaders often rose to political leadership within the tribe as well, creating a kind of reverse type of structure of leadership. The church at Aquinnah was led by Wampanoag community members from the mainland and the island well into the 19th century, before white ministers began to take over. But beyond the leadership roles, the church was still used for non-religious purposes by the tribe, including acting as the schoolhouse for years and a space for non-religious tribal meetings. It was a community hub into the 19th century and the early 20th century. So, I guess some concluding thoughts about Aquinnah. Throughout this history, the Wampanoag of Aquinnah skillfully adapted Christianity to support their own needs. They used the church structure to preserve their language and traditions and political systems, and maintain sovereignty and cultural identity even under colonial pressure. So rather than simply assimilating, they found a way to reinterpret this Christian institution to serve their own priorities and protect their way of life. So this is a thing we're going to see as we continue forward. So it took a while. We're now moving over to Narragansett, over to Rhode Island territory, and it took a while for Christianity to take a hold within the Narragansett. And a lot of that had to do with them being relatively stubborn about it, but also that they had managed to stay relatively independent of colonial interference significantly later. And so it's not until about the 1740s, with the beginning of the Great Awakening here in New England, otherwise known as like the New Light movement, that we actually see something catch on. And so the Great Awakening was this liberal spiritual wave that landed in New England in approximately the 1730s or 1740s. And in addition to sparking a spiritual awakening amongst colonial Christians, it's during this period that we see Native people taking ever more control of their faith and an interest in Christianity. And so it's during this time that we see mass conversions in the region from Indigenous folks. And I think it's important to note that I think one of the reasons why it gained traction, especially at Narragansett, was that Great Awakening philosophy emphasized this personal individual relationship between the worshiper and God himself. And it was pretty critical of some of the bureaucratic and institutional staleness, for lack of a different word, that many of the colonial churches had maintained. And I think it was that individuality of a spiritual experience that spoke to a lot of Indigenous folks. But it's in the midst of this that the Narragansett Indian Church gets its start. And it's actually founded by a tribal member named Samuel Niles. And he was formerly the powwow, or the medicine man, for the tribe. And so in 1743, he gets kicked out of the Congregationalist church that he's attending for exhorting in the congregation, or in other words, being way too loud in the pews. And so he's kicked out, and he takes about 100 other tribal members with him. And together, they return to the Narragansett Reservation, and they establish their own Indigenous-led congregation. And while he competes with this Pequot minister named James Simon for a number of years, ultimately Niles's Free Will Baptist approach is what catches on at Narragansett. And so they established the Narragansett Indian Church. And that is still the Narragansett Indian Church that is on our reservation today, albeit it's a different physical structure than it was then. And so far from being an adherent to the dominating colonial culture, Niles was actually a vocal advocate of Indigenous liberties and a very outspoken critic of any clergy that he felt were disrespecting the word or seeking to take advantage of tribal peoples. So that's why I've gone with this particular quote of his, because I think it's important to think about the ways in which Indigenous people are reasoning through Christianity for themselves, and they're not blindly engaging with the faith at all. They're actually critically taking in the Bible, its passages, and thinking about how it should apply to the lived experience. And so I think it's also important to note that Niles's commentary and his critical approach to life doesn't just end with people outside of the tribe. So in 1759, the Narragansett sachem Thomas Ninigret rises to the head of the tribe. And it's during a time of personal financial crisis. He is in significant debt and involved in multiple lawsuits. And to solve his problems, he ends up asking the Rhode Island General Assembly to remove long-standing laws that had prevented tribal leaders from selling tribal lands. And so the Assembly actually agrees, and they repeal these laws that had protected the remaining Narragansett territory. And this gives Thomas Ninigret the authority to sell lots of land without approval from the community itself. And this decision causes major conflict within the tribe, as this threatens their livelihood, since most of their coastal lands and farmlands are what Ninigret is actually selling to pay off his debts. And so the tribe pushes back, and the person who actually leads this opposition is Samuel Niles himself. So far from being just a religious leader, he's also doubling as a political figure. And so by 1763, he rallies support from within the tribe and also multiple ministers throughout his Christian network throughout New England. And together, they push back against Thomas Ninigret. So that same year, in 1763, Niles and 85 tribal members petitioned both the Rhode Island General Assembly and the British Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. And the main concern that they're bringing to the table is the repeal of this land law. And so in response, the Assembly actually temporarily freezes Ninigret's ability to sell land. But still fearing that the freeze won't hold, Niles and his followers turn to the British Crown, and they send 2 tribal youth, Tobias and John Shattuck, to carry a petition directly to the king to plead the tribe's case in England and Scotland in 1767. And Niles had been right to doubt the pause on the land sales because ultimately the General Assembly does lift the ban in 1768 and rules that Ninigret can sell enough land to pay his debts. In 1769, the protection is completely erased, and now he's even allowed to sell lands that are being cultivated by other tribal members. And so these sales ultimately do continue until Ninigret's passing the following year. And now I think it's important that despite the failure of Niles and his followers to stop the hemorrhage of land, this whole episode in Narragansett history shows how the tribe strategically was able to combine religious leadership, the formal education that had come in through that Christianization, and diplomacy in their resistance. And Niles and the Shaddocks were able to rally so much more support because they were connected with various non-Indigenous ministers and religious allies in the New England region. And so the attempt at impeaching Thomas Ninigret reveals a powerful moment of mobilization that's largely made possible through the networks that had been built through the tribal church from the 1740s and into the 1760s. But perhaps the most prominent example of Indigenous solidarity that comes through the Indigenous network and religious networks during the Great Awakening is the Brothertown Indian movement, which ultimately turns into the Brothertown Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. And so this all begins in 1740 when a young Mohegan man named Samson Occam converts to Christianity. And Occam begins his schooling with this reverend named Eleazar Wheelock at the Moore's Charity Indian School from 1743 to 1747. And Wheelock School was created to provide education to Indigenous youth so that they could serve as missionaries in other Indigenous communities further west. By 1749, Occam follows through with this vision and begins ministering to the Montauk. By 1761, 1763, Occam and his brother-in-law are now ministering to folks up in Haudenosaunee, but specifically the Oneida up that way. And during this period, Wheelock comes up with this idea to establish a university for Indigenous youth. And if you know anything about it, this is Dartmouth College that Wheelock is actually brainstorming during this period. And so he recruits Samson Occam and another minister during the time to sail across the ocean to England and Scotland and raise funds for the establishment of Dartmouth College. So this is in roughly 1765. By the time Occam comes back from this mission, he discovers that Wheelock has completely changed the vision of the university. It's no longer going to educate Indigenous youth. It's going to be focused on colonial children. And he finds that Wheelock has also left his family to become destitute. So Occam and Wheelock have this major falling out. And now Occam starts to think about the ways that he wants to live out his Christian Indigenous identity. And so Occam, alongside with other former students at Moore's Indian Charity School, his brother-in-law, and various other Christian Native leaders throughout the region, come to some agreement to establish an Indigenous praying town. And they settle on territory up in New York near the Oneida Reservation, where Occam already had inroads. And so in 1783, they begin to move out that way. Tunxus, Narragansett, Mohegan, Montauk, and Niantic, and Pequot tribal citizens all start making their way out to upstate New York, and they establish this essentially Christian Indigenous utopia, and they call it Brothertown. And they're there for a number of years before they're ultimately pushed out by more settlers, and they end up in Wisconsin eventually. And so there's a whole other leg to the Brothertown story, and all the legal convolutions that they face as the United States tries to make sense of what to do with this Indigenous tribal village church entity. But ultimately they become a tribe. But I think for the purposes of this talk, Brothertown is important because at this period, the majority of Christian natives in this region, especially at Mohegan and Narragansett, pretty much leave and they go to Brothertown. And so that completely shifts the shape of the native Christian presence here in southern New England. Actually, like the bulk of the Niles family actually ends up in Brothertown as well. But I think secondly, it's also important because it shows how Christianity creates one of the earliest pan-Indian movements. And it also shows us how Christianity for Indigenous peoples during this time wasn't solely about assimilating at all, but instead, this Christian Indigenous identity was a new shared one that transcended tribal lines. And their identity in Christianity was very distinct from that which other colonists at the time held. And so now, I'm going to jump forward a little bit in time and focus on the Mashpee Woodland Revolt, which is probably one of the more better known episodes of Indigenous resistance here in southern New England. But I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the religious parts of the revolt. So, in Plymouth Colony, Eliot's model of praying towns took root early, and by 1655, missionary Richard Bourne received approval to start a church in Mashpee. And a decade later, the area was officially designated as a praying town. Following Bourne's death in 1685, the role of the pastor was passed to a Mashpee tribal member named Simon Popinett, and it marked a transition to tribal control for the church. Now, Popinett was a son of Mashpee Sachem, and during his time at the helm of the church, he also served as a political leader for his community, seeking redress for the problems of forced servitude and colonial claims on tribal lands. Once again, we're seeing the blend of political awareness and advocacy within the tribal church. However, even during this period, outside interference continued to persist, and over the course of the 18th century, an increasingly oppressive overseership is placed over the Mashpee, first by the colony and then the state of Massachusetts. And the overseers had control over the natural resources there. And specifically, this becomes an issue because they have control over the old-growth forest around Mashpee. And they often acted exploitatively, and they often profited off of the resources that they were meant to be safeguarding for the tribe. So needless to say, Mashpee's relationship with their overseers and proprietors is pretty tense. So in 1811, Harvard University, through a missionary fund, appoints Reverend Phineas Fish to lead the old Indian meeting house at Mashpee. Now, there had already been a system by which the university was bringing different ministers to the church there, and the Mashpee had already had a somewhat tense relationship with some of them. But I think it's important to note that at this period of time, the Mashpee aren't opposed to Christianity itself at all, and they had been following and advocating for an Indigenous minister in the decades leading up to Fish's arrival to take over the church, essentially. And this man's name was Thomas Jeffers. But they did have an issue with the ways in which the management of their church was being usurped and carried on without their input. And in many ways, Phineas Fish, like some other ministers that had come through, was more of a religious imposition than a welcome presence. And I think they were right to feel that way. So upon Fish's arrival, he claims control of their parsonage, and immediately he restricts native access to the old Indian meeting house. So the tribe is barred from holding their own services and also barred from holding tribal meetings in the space, which they had been doing for generations at this point. And during this time, he predominantly only preaches to local white residents, which is not what was in his contract to begin with. All this inflames pre-existing tensions that had been rising regarding the exploitative overseers and the illegal sale of old-growth timber on tribal lands. Now, given the situation, over the years, Mashpee members filed multiple complaints to the state government, but nothing changed. So in 1833, a Pequot preacher named William Apis visits Mashpee as a guest minister, and he's shocked to discover that Fish's congregation at the meeting house contains basically no tribal members. and the Indigenous residents were actually gathering elsewhere to listen to a fellow tribesman, Joseph, or Blind Joe, Amos, preach. And together, APHIS and Mashpee leaders end up drafting petitions to the state government of Massachusetts and Harvard University, and in order to seek and remove fish from the meeting house, and also to bring an end to the overseership. This includes a speaking tour across the state to raise awareness about the corruption down in Mashpee. And when all these efforts are ignored, the Mashpee declare independence in July of 1833. And so this is a kickoff to the event or series of events that we refer to as the Mashpee Woodland Revolt. I do think it's important to note that the title of revolt is a sensationalized one built around white fear at the period. And in reality, it was a series of peaceful protests petitioning for rights of self-management and freedom of religious practice. And the protests included the seizure of downed logs by timber poachers and eventually even the physical foisting of Reverend Fish out of the old Indian meeting house. So this revolt sets in motion a series of reforms that give Mashpee a degree of self-governance. Nothing perfect, but a degree of self-governance. And it ultimately leads to the division of the reservation into a district of privately held lots. In addition to this, Blind Joe Amos's efforts for religious freedom lead to the establishment of the Mashpee Baptist Church and the Mashpee Baptist Society, which over time gains traction amongst the Mashpee, and the second church gradually becomes the new hub for the tribal nation in the years to come, albeit the old Indian meeting house is still used for specialized ceremonies and different events. And so, yet again, similar to at Narragansett, but albeit facing a different legal front, we see the ways in which religious networks, specifically the network from the Pequot to the Mashpee at this time, allows for some movement in the political and legal needs of the Mashpee. And that's something that is facilitated through, if not the old Indian meeting house, then the Christian community at Mashpee, in part. And so lastly, I'm going to close with looking at the Mohegan Indian Church and Indian removal. And so in 1830, Andrew Jackson backs the Indian Removal Act. It doesn't back it. At this point, it's been backed and it's passed in 1830. And this bill was intended to facilitate the removal of southeastern tribes to Indian Territory, which is west of the Mississippi at this time. And this is done in order to free up lands in the southern states for white Americans to move on to and use. Now, the tribes that are most notably impacted by this act were the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. Remember, the Cherokee's removal is the Trail of Tears. But what many people don't realize is that the Indian Removal Act also threatened tribal nations in the northern United States, and that included those tribes here in New England. So the years leading up to the passage of the act, Mohegan tribal members sought to create a solution to the impending threat. And so it's at this time that Mohegan tribal members, Lucy Tecumwis and Cynthia Tecumwis Hoscott, decide that a tribal church would be the best approach to justifying them remaining in Connecticut. And so they reach out to a local woman in Norwich, Connecticut named Sarah Huntington, who had been working to school Mohegan children for a number of years. And they essentially formed an alliance with her to begin establishing this church. And so the Mohegan choice to build a church at this period comes from a desire to dispel this prevailing mindset in Washington, D.C., that Indigenous people are inherently incapable of being a part of broader American society because they are by nature uncivilized and unchristianized. That's a quote, not my words. And so by establishing a church and proving that the local Indigenous community were practicing Christians, they believed that they could make a case against removal. And it's worth noting that the Mohegan aren't the only tribe at this time to make that gamble and construct a church specifically to combat the Removal Act. So quite fittingly, the land that the women settle on for the church belongs to Lucy Occam Tantaquidgeon, who is the sister of Mohegan minister Samson Occam, who created the Brothertown movement. And the tribal members invested in this strategy ultimately end up seeking support from Sarah Huntington's cousin, Jabez Huntington, who's a U.S. House Rep of Connecticut, and from the Secretary of War, Lewis Cass, who, and it's important just to note, they were seeking support from the Secretary of War because Indian Affairs was in the Department of War during this point of history. And so the church opens its doors in 1831, and the combination of support from the local non-Indigenous community, these strategic allies, ultimately helps to shield the Mohegan from forced removal. But beyond protecting them from removal, the church and its grounds would prove themselves to be a multifaceted community haven throughout the decades to follow, especially in the years following detribalization. So between 1862 and 1880, Southern New England tribes were subjected to acts of enfranchisement or forced citizenship within the state assemblies of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And so these acts are portrayed as benevolent legislation to set tribal people on the same footing as other citizens of the state. But in actuality, these detribalization acts are illegal, and they strip Indigenous people throughout the region of their inherent rights of sovereignty and self-government, and it violates constitutional precedent, since Indian Affairs is actually a federal issue, not a state one. Between 1869 and 1870, the state of Massachusetts detribalizes all the tribes within its territorial bounds, with Mashpee and Aquinnah being disbanded last. And in place of a reservation or an Indian district, the towns of Gayhead and Mashpee are established. In 1872, the state of Connecticut detribalizes the Mohegan. In 1880, the Narragansett are detribalized by the state of Rhode Island. And in return for their allotment of their reservations and the erasure of the tribal status, these Indigenous peoples are given state citizenship, which is not the same as U.S. citizenship because that wouldn't come until the Snyder Act of 1924. So during this period of detribalization, there is one shared fact across the Narragansett, Mashpee-Wampanoag, Aquinnah-Wampanoag, and Mohegan tribes, and that is a continued presence of their respective tribal churches and their church grounds. So when the respective state governments had detribalized the Mohegan and Narragansett, they specifically set aside the churches and their grounds for the management and use of religious societies. And at Mashpee and Aquinnah, the establishment of the town ensured that the church at least fell within the territorial bounds of what remained for those Indigenous communities. And in so doing, the state governments almost essentially accidentally leave behind these Indigenous institutions. And of course they're doing it because they assume that churches are American institutions or colonial institutions, or not ones that are a threat to the ongoing forced assimilation of Indigenous people. But in reality, they actually leave behind the stronghold for these Native communities. And so, while the tribal churches act in far less dramatic ways throughout the 20th century, their continued existence is still important to the continued day-to-day lives of these respective Indigenous communities. So tribal churches are vital to maintaining, in the years post-detribalization, a geographic center. So the disbandment of the reservations, even though Indigenous people are granted these allotments, a lot of them are lost due to the introduction of taxation on these lands, which easily could have torn these communities apart, but the churches still remained, and so this is a hub, a physical hub that these communities continue to return to. They allow for social cohesion. So thinking back to that quote at the beginning from Joshua Noka, attending church and seeing your relative or cousin or member of your tribal community that you haven't seen in years, you literally have this touch point Sunday to Sunday or on larger holidays or during larger celebrations that the tribal bodies hold in these churches. You have this opportunity for communities to reconnect and socially remain connected. They're also important for ceremonies and cultural events. So especially here at Narragansett, where our powwow grounds are held on our church grounds, um, or at Mohegan, where the church grounds host the wigwam festivals, not only are they places for Indigenous people to return and engage with their own culture, it's also this visible symbol to non-Indigenous people outside of the community to continue seeing this ongoing presence of an Indigenous body. And that becomes important as these tribes go on to regain federal acknowledgement decades later. They are also important in reversing the paper genocide, what we refer to as a paper genocide, which is the erasing and re-racing of Indigenous people in the written record during the 18th and 19th and 20th century. You literally have a physical written manifestation of these Indigenous people still being there and still continuing to come back to the same point. And so, once again, when it comes to seeking recognition in the 70s, 80s, and beyond, churches end up becoming this great repository of written documentation. And then lastly, the Native ministers are still a part of these churches, and just as in past generations, they continue to be on the front line of maintaining their communities internally, but also doing outreach to the broader Christian network. So whether that was engaging in the early pan-Indian revitalization efforts in the 1920s and the 1930s, or preaching across multiple tribal churches in their lifetime, or doing guest sermons at various non-Indigenous churches, and doing intercommunity work to help facilitate connection beyond the reservation, or the former reservations. Like in generations past, they were out there fighting for their communities. And so that brings me to the conclusion of this talk. And I know I'm a little bit over, but now that we've covered these histories from the 17th century to the 20th century, to summarize, tribal churches provided a physical meeting space and a geographic focal point in the midst of colonization and beyond. And that becomes increasingly important as tribal peoples lose their land base. And throughout history, tribal churches are also a space in which, yes, Indigenous people are acting on Christianity, but they're also oftentimes and almost universally allowed to find ways to preserve and blend their own traditional beliefs in a safe space, in what's considered to be an accepted religious structure during the colonial period and beyond. Tribal churches acted as a sanctuary, whether it was Niles and Apis and Amos fighting legal battles, or Samson Occam creating the Brothertown movement to quite literally escape the pressures of colonial American society. These tribal churches are a place in which Indigenous people find safety in the midst of an ever-changing world, and even into detribalization and beyond. It's one thing that is not taken away. And they also operated as we saw, as political spaces for tribes to mobilize, but also at Aquinnah we see the ways in which the tribal government was able to transpose onto the praying town government, and the ways in which, in the early days, that allowed a type of continuity in the midst of so much upheaval in the early colonial days. So given these examples and others like it, I think we have to critically rethink about how we think about Native conversion. And we can no longer see it as some kind of acceptance or colonial. Sometimes we can no longer see it as an acceptance of colonial or American assimilative practices, because that would be to ignore the reality of what many Christian natives were doing. Contrary to some reigning beliefs, many Indigenous people who picked up the banner for Christianity actively flew in the face of colonial and American expectations and desires. And they refused to simply fade into the margins of society. These Narragansett, Wampanoag, and Mohegan practitioners used their faith in churches as leverage to advance their autonomy and to uplift the causes that they themselves valued and that they knew were important to their communities. And so, in many ways, we should be able to step back and see Native Christianities here in this region, and the use of these tribal churches as an expression of Indigenous autonomy and agency. And yeah, I'll go ahead and stop my talk there.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I heard the name Samson Occam before today, and it was mentioned in the context of being one of the original mutual aid temperance societies that were precursors to AA, the model for AA. Is there any thought or further discussion on that you can add?
I've actually not heard that history before. I do know at one point in speaking about intertribal connection through the churches, at one point after he had come back from England, I know that Occam had a issue with alcohol. And so at that time, Samuel Niles actually took over his congregation as he was bringing himself back to a state of health and spiritually realigning himself. And so I wouldn't be shocked if his own experience in that might have had something to do with his involvement in establishing that. But then again, that would be me speculating more than me being able to speak to facts on his involvement in the precursor to AA.
Thank you so much. But I'm looking at an abstract, William L. White, pre-AA Alcoholic Mutual Aid Societies, and that's where I'm getting it from. That's where I
Okay.
heard it. So I just thank you though. I really appreciate because it does kind of validate the context that this could be the case. Thank you.
Thaddeus, if you have that link or that resource and you'd like to share that, I can pass that on to Kimonee. It might be worth checking out.
Sure. I appreciate it. Yes.
Sure, will do. I'll put it in the chat, and thank you so much. There's so much history we don't know, and it's just a ongoing process, and I really appreciate this.
Well, thank you.
Learning is a lifetime. There's many other comments just thanking you for this presentation down in our chat. So we'll gather all those and share those with you as well. I just want to thank you again for this presentation. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you'll join us next month on July 28th for a presentation with Jason Mancini entitled The Narragansett Chief, or The Adventures of a Wanderer, Recovering an Indigenous Autobiography. You're also welcome to join us for Tamaqua Museum's Longhouse celebration put on by our Indigenous Empowerment Center. On Saturday, July 12th from noon to 4, you can join us at Farm Fresh Rhode Island Project up in Providence. There you can admire the talents of 8 wonderful Indigenous artists who have collaborated with the steel yard to construct a longhouse using welding techniques. So everyone is welcome. It'll be a day with food and native vendors and lots of fun and enjoying this new art that's going to be installed one day at our new museum. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Be sure to check out our website for these and other events that are coming up. And if you'd like to support more programs like this, consider visiting our website at tamaquagmuseum.org and making a donation today. Thank you again to our sponsors at the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the United Way, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, and all of you. Stay cool. Have a lovely afternoon. Pishkanash. Thank you so much, Kimonee. I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.